chapter of Women for Kansas. I'm Kelly Wall. I'm one of the co-leaders here in Lawrence, along with Adina Morse, and she's unable to attend because of COVID in the family. So watch out, COVID is on the rise again. And we do receive support from Ty Edwards, who's here today, videotaping our public forum, and she serves on the Executive Committee of Leadership for Women for Kansas. If you didn't receive a handout as you came in, you can find out more about our organization on womenforkansas.org. And I'll just give you a brief synopsis that we are a nonprofit grassroots organization started in 2013 during the Brownback era to restore integrity, fiscal responsibility, and balance in Kansas by electing moderates. Moderate candidates to public office who will uphold our legislative priorities. And our mission is to recruit, motivate, and educate women who will actively participate in the process of electing moderates to public office, who will advocate for moderate policies. So I've used the word moderate several times, and I'm here in Lawrence, Kansas, so I'm going to tell you, I'm going to read our legislative priorities that we consider moderate policies. A fair, progressive tax system that adequately funds public services. A court system free from political influence. Equal rights for all citizens. Separation of church and state. Advocacy of healthcare rights and opportunities. Equal access for immigrant families. Sensible gun legislation. Reproductive rights. Preservation of excellence in public schools and higher education. Recognition of and support for the arts as vital to our quality of life, and protection of our environment against avoidable degradation and depletion of our natural resources. And again, you can find this information on our website, womenforkansas.org. You can become a dues-paying member, and you can sign up for email updates in our weekly newsletter, News You Can Use, which regularly features articles from the Kansas Reflector, as well as articles from writers from other newspapers across the state, and we include a wide variety of voices and issues that line up with our legislative priorities. I wanted to just plug our next meeting, September 23rd, 10:30, downstairs. Libby Hastings of Kansans for Advocates for Better Care will talk to us about elder care and the issues facing elder care in our state and across the nation. It's a crisis. And October 7th, we'll have Davis Hammett from Loudlight, and that again will be at 10:30. I just want to take a minute as we all kind of settle into our space before I introduce our guests to take a moment and reflect on the value of having a free, independent press. I bet you could use that, right? So it's protected by our First Amendment, along with our right to worship or not. It's protected. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press. It's often referred to as the fourth estate of a democratic government and plays a widely accepted role in providing citizens with information we can use to check government power. With the rapid decline of print journalism in the past 20 to 30 years, more people are depending upon online news sources to get their information. And so with that, let me introduce the members today of the Kansas Reflector. First, we have Sherman Smith. He's the editor-in-chief, a two-time Kansas Press Association Journalist of the Year. Before founding Kansas Reflector, he spent 16 years at the Topeka Capital Journal, and he graduated from Oregon State University in 2004 or as he likes to say, when the university still valued English and journalism. And we have his intern, Sam. Sam Bailey, sorry. And next to her we have Rachel Mipro, a graduate of Louisiana State University. And Rachel covered government politics in Baton Rouge in New Orleans. That must have been very colorful. She and her fellow team of journalists were 2022 Goldsmith Prize semifinalists for their work featuring the rise of the KKK in northern Louisiana following racially motivated shootings in 1960. Since moving to Kansas, she's turned her focus to Kansas politics. Welcome, Rachel. We have Tim Carpenter, who's worked and reported in Kansas and for Kansas for 35 years and has covered the Capitol for 16 years at the Topeka Capital Journal and has also previously worked for Lawrence Journal World and UPI. Thank you for being here, Tim. And Clay. Am I back on? Hello, you here? Yeah. Okay, I might have to change out batteries, we'll see. Clay Wirestone, Kansas Reflector Opinion Editor. His columns have been published in the Kansas City Star, Wichita Eagle, and other newspapers and websites across the state and nation. Before joining the Reflector in the summer of 2021, Clay worked at the nonprofit Kansas Action for Children as communications director for 4 years. Welcome, Clay, and thanks for getting here. So just to plug through its opinion section, the Kansas Reflector accepts commentaries and tries to amplify voices of people, of those who are affected by public policies or who may be marginalized. And Women for Kansas members and leaders have submitted articles and have had commentaries published there as well. And then we have, at the end, we have Allison Kite. She's a data reporter for the Missouri Independent and the Kansas Reflector with a focus on the environment and agriculture. A graduate of KU, she's covered state government in both Topeka and Jefferson City, and most recently a City Hall reporter for the Kansas City Star. Welcome, Allison. Okay, and they do have a sign-up sheet on one of the tables towards the back if you want to sign up to receive their newsletter. Also, Women for Kansas, we had sign-up sheets if you want to be involved locally and receive our newsletter. And we have a donation jar to help cover expenses such as renting this room. So, following their presentation, we will take questions from the audience, and so we do invite your participation today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sherman Smith.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. Thank you to Women for Kansas for making this happen, and thank you all for being here. You know, you tracked the events yesterday in Marion County. You know what important it is to have a free press today. And it's nice to see this kind of showing for what we do. I'm just going to have some brief remarks kind of about our origin story because we like to save as much time as we can to hear from all of you guys with questions. So we launched Kansas Reflector 3 years ago during the pandemic. We are an affiliate of States Newsroom, which is a nonprofit out of North Carolina. They're working to put journalists back into the state houses where the ranks have been depleted all across the country. And so they do the heavy lifting. I know a lot of people want to know where our funding comes from. Most of it comes from them. They do fundraising around this idea of doing public journalism, doing journalism for the public good. They are not funded by George Soros like our critics claim, but I always say if you know how to get in touch with George, please put in a good word for us. We can use all the reporters we can get. And we're also supported by local donations from people like you or readers all across the state who support what we're doing. That allows us to have a camera that we can use in the State House where there's kind of muddy yellow light, and we can travel around the state to write stories out of places like Marion where we can pay our reporters to travel there and back. It means that we can file CORA requests, those are open records requests, with people who really don't want us to have their information. We had an incident earlier this year where Emporia State University suggested an outrageous number for a very simple request, and we put out a call for support, and right away we had plenty of donations to support not only that request, but also to actually hire an intern from Emporia State for that summer. So that we can continue to be a nuisance to them. 3 years ago, right before the pandemic, the guy in charge of State's newsroom came to Kansas to try to find somebody who would be an editor. He met with Clay, actually. He was at Kansas Action for Children. Clay has a different version of the story, but basically Clay said, that sounds like a really stupid idea. I want nothing to do with it. It's going to fail. But you should talk to Sherman because he's crazy enough to try it. And I was. So
that story has gotten less accurate.
So I agreed to do this. I convinced Tim to leave the Capital Journal, where the two of us have been since 2004, to come with me. CJ Genevieve was our first opinion editor. She'd written the definitive book on LGBTQ rights in Kansas, and I'd had the chance to work with her on a collaboration I did with Public Radio Reporter the year before on foster care issues, and she was the editor for that. So she came on for a year and then went back to KCUR. We had another reporter at the start, but we were able to add Allison Kite after about 6 months. Also had worked with her at the Capital Journal. I think everybody here except for Sam and Rachel had worked at the Capital Journal at some point. Clay had convinced when I was managing editor to move back home from New Hampshire to run our copy desk as a copy editor, help show reporters how to write. So it's been a kind of a nice reunion of sorts here. Rachel we were able to bring up from Louisiana last year, and I think she's made an immediate impact in her reporting in the State House and across the state. She may be the only reason the St. Mary's Library is open right now. So for me, this has been a dream come true. We get to do this as a nonprofit where we alone decide what we're going to write and how we're going to write it, and we focus on doing this as a public service. I tell everybody that we're not writing to people in the State House or people who are obsessed with politics, or certainly not legislators, the lobbyists, the agency staff, any of that. We're writing to, as I call it, the grungy populace. And we like doing these town halls around the state because we hear directly from you about what's important from you. We think it strengthens our relationship with you in the audience, and we like to tell our story because too often news media over the years have let somebody else tell our story. So, anybody want to make any opening remarks before anybody at all?
So I did not think it was a terrible idea, and I thought Sherman was and is an exceptional and visionary editor, and I thought that he would be ideal for what Chris at State's Newsroom was putting together. And I will admit I was a little uncertain about how things would go, but it had nothing to do with Sherman. It just had to do with the fact that if anyone here follows online, there's a lot of places that say we're a nonprofit journalism operation that start up, and then you look, a year or two in the future, and what's really been generated. Sometimes something good, sometimes not much. I think what's most remarkable about the Kansas Reflector is over these 3 years, Sherman, and the folks that he's brought in have created something that I think is really special journalistically in Kansas, and I'm very proud to be part of it.
So this is the reason why we're here. We're now to the point where you guys get to ask questions, and you shouldn't hold back. You can ask us tough questions. We'll give you great answers. Right here. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what the basis of the judge's issuance of the warrant in the Marion County matter? What law was she citing?
Okay, so
I'm going to repeat the question
Yes, go ahead.
for the recording for everybody. So your question is about the Marion County Record and the raid on the office, and then what was the rest of it?
Yeah, the magistrate issued a warrant to allow the police and the sheriff to come in and seize all their equipment. And I'm wondering what the basis of that warrant was. What was cited in your article was a federal law, but I didn't see anything specific.
So I believe the answer is the magistrate judge is off the rails on this and has no standing, didn't understand the process of trying to get evidence from people. There's a lot of small town politics involved in this. Quick background. The local police in Marion, Kansas, with a couple sheriff's deputies, raided the Marion County newspaper and took all their phones, this is yesterday, took all their phones, all their laptops, all the equipment they need to publish their paper in a dispute that involved a local restaurateur who had a DUI and had a pending request for a liquor license. And you know, it's gritty small town politics, but in the end, I think it was a massive overreach. They also raided the homes of these individuals. So, you know, just incredible. There was elderly people in these homes that had no idea what was going on. Sherman called one of the houses, and the woman couldn't understand what he's saying because of hearing impediment. And so she actually handed the phone to one of the deputies, I think, who was standing there. And he didn't want to talk. Now, not surprisingly, the police chief became... you know, he went to a non-disclosed location and didn't want to talk to the media yesterday. But the story has been a mushroom cloud across the country. Because imagine if you were sitting at the New York Times and the NYPD came in and said, oh, we are investigating an identity theft claim, and we're going to seize all the thousands of computers in this room and everybody's phones, and by the way, we're raiding all of your houses and taking all your IT equipment out of there as well. So they took photographs of billing records. I think they were trying to find maybe a leak out of the police department, or certainly intimidate the paper into not publishing any more content that they didn't like. So the judge, we think, is off her rocker.
And before we move on to the next question, we really have to highlight our intern here. She was a little late this morning, and I'm never going to get sick of saying this because she was sending pictures to the New York Times.
So before this happened yesterday, Sam's assignment was to go track down the guy driving the Save Canada from Tyranny truck in downtown Topeka. And so she had just come back and said, well, that was an interview. And I said, how would you like to do something else? Pack your stuff, you're going to Marion.
Thanks for that. Yeah. That was an adventure. It was an adventure of a day, and I'm glad I was able to go and take photos and things. But the Canada to Marion drive was crazy.
My question is, does the Marion Record have any plans to publish their paper in another location like McPherson or somewhere else?
I think there's kind of a coordinated effort to make sure that they can publish. The publisher told me yesterday that they're definitely going to do it somehow. And I've seen some communication from other journalists out there, and of course we're willing to stand by and help them make sure that they can get published. There's just, you know, some real hurdles. So all of the advertisements that they had planned to publish, you know, those files, the digital files, those are all gone. Legal notices from the county that they're obligated to publish, they don't have those anymore. You know, there's just a lot of complications. So, you know, they're going to publish something, but it's just not clear what exactly that'll look like yet. But I have to say, you know, there are small towns across Kansas that have been, you know, the newspapers have just been decimated by the economic reality. This is kind of a little bit of an outlier in that in a town of 2,000, they have a staff of maybe 5 reporters or something like that here. And this is a publisher who spent 20 years at the Milwaukee Sentinel, and then 26 years as a journalism professor at the University of Illinois. And then just kind of, I guess, as a retirement hobby, decided I'm going to go back home and run this newspaper that He had bought in '98 because his dad worked there for 50 years. So they thought they were going to intimidate him. This was the wrong place. Like, there are places where police could go in, maybe there'd be one 20-something scared out of his mind, not knowing what's happening, and the owner is a corporation 20 states away. This is not the case, you know. I think he's prepared to fight back.
My question is, do you know if any group like the ACLU is coming to help battle this? Because we really need to not let this fall.
Yeah, there are a number of groups, national and local. Kansas Press Association is coordinating those efforts and is on top of it. Yeah. Don't be shy.
If there aren't questions, we're going to call on people.
Oh, no.
This isn't about Marion, is that okay?
Oh, yes.
Please.
I've lived in Kansas for about 6 or 7 years, and I'm wondering if you all know how is the population declining, and is our legislator not aware that people aren't going to move here if they keep passing laws that young people don't want to come to our state?
Yeah. So I think the answer is, I don't know that it's declining in absolute terms. I think it is, you know, pure number to number. It is just growing exceptionally slowly. I think Rachel actually reported a couple of weeks ago that something, you know, the birth rate is declining. But I think you put your finger on a really exceptionally good point about Kansas, which is that I think if you look back over the last 20 to 30 years in Kansas, the only reason that our population has grown at all is because of immigration. And particularly, I believe in immigration in the Hispanic and Latino communities. You know, it's not Kansans that are coming, but, you know, a lot of folks that are from here are leaving. I think that is an exceptional point. But we also live in a state where there is such rock solid Republican control of the legislature that we have incredible gerrymandering going on in terms of the representation. And if you think it's been bad before, you ain't seen nothing yet. This is something Sherman and I are talking about as either a column or a story. The redistricting that was just done, that we have not even necessarily had elections under yet, is pretty remarkable for the state Senate and House.
Policies that might run people off.
I'm being put on the spot here. So I cover both Kansas and Missouri. I have a preference for one over the other. It's one, Missouri. I live in Missouri, unfortunately, but I consider myself a Kansan. But I think you see the same thing in both states, and I think Missouri is probably more farther down the road in terms of its gerrymandering and kind of culture war style of legislating. Kansas tends to kind of moderate itself every few years after things. Okay, the microphone's on. So I don't. That's all I got.
So, you know, we had the big constitutional amendment last year vote. It was rejected in all 4 congressional districts, landslide election. A lot of people thought that amendment might pass. And so I think that is a suggestion that the politics coming out of the State House is maybe a bit antiquated. I include myself among the near elderly. And so I think some of the, if you look at the demographic of the legislators in the Capitol, they're a bunch of old white guys. And that's a big problem. And the people that are leaving Kansas are largely leaving rural areas and depositing themselves in more urban centers. But a lot of the representation from those rural areas is staunchly conservative. And I think some of them would just be happy to let people unlike themselves move away. You know, they're not hospitable to people that have different ideas about religion and education and their personal life and gender and things like that. And so they're more than happy to drive people out. which is very toxic to a community, I would think, unless you want everybody to be a robot.
And I'll add on one more thing really quick. We are seeing a declining birth rate. Once again, we've hit like record-breaking lows. And then that's not necessarily an area of panic because that's happening across the U.S. at large. But I think a lot of this stuff, and particularly educational issues like anti-DEI, that sort of thing, I think all that's really coming from a fear response, you know? We're seeing less and less kids grow up here in Kansas, less entering the schools. And I think there's a tendency to panic over that and say, oh my gosh, we've got less kids now, we've got to really look at this, and then maybe come to some conclusions that, as a journalist, I'm just going to say most people don't agree with. I'm going to try and clear the opinion editor, so I'm going to avoid voicing opinion. But again, I think a lot of this is based in fear, what we're seeing coming out of the legislature now, and maybe more progressive policies would help with bringing more people in.
We're going to try to switch out the mics here. I think it's worth making the point too that a lot of the counties in Kansas, particularly those outside of the major urban areas, the population peaked in a census count in the 1800s.
One other quick point about legislation. A lot of this stuff is coming from national think tanks, conservative think tanks, and they're just having model legislation and dumping it in, and they just find a couple legislators to carry water for them in the Capitol. And it's in Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska and other states as well. So that's where you can see bills that are introduced in the Kansas legislature and they read exactly like the bill introduced in the Tennessee legislature.
So if our legislators become newsletter editors at our expense, oh, okay. How are they going to be trained, and can we send the police to their homes and get all their records?
Okay, it's on now. First of all, thank you for reading that story. You know, I really didn't think anyone was gonna read it. I appreciate that, first of all. Glad, you know, brownie points over there. So the story she's referencing is basically, we're waiting on a final decision. I think that will be coming next week, but it would be a pretty big raise in funding for any lawmakers to send out their newsletters to rural communities and anyone in their community. The kind of issue here is that while it's obviously a great thing for lawmakers to communicate with their people, their Kansan populations, is that some of them have said that they only send the letters out to Republican candidates or people who voted for them. So that's somewhat of, I would say, an issue for people who don't want their funding to go to places where they don't necessarily get that info. But we're waiting on a final decision. I'm pretty sure that's going to go through, though, because everyone voted in favor. But yeah, that will be next week, basically.
So she's referencing a request by the House Speaker to raise the allotment for legislators to send out mailers to their constituents because they're waiting breathlessly for whatever latest conclusions those legislators have. And you know, obviously, it's a part of the incumbent advantage to be able to send out mailers at taxpayer expense, and they really want more of that. They're for less government, but for more free public exposure for themselves.
There was a question about teaching them how to edit newsletters. I would settle for just having them read news stories by anybody else.
So to your comment earlier about maybe the worst is yet to come, and we still have yet to see the ramifications of the most recent gerrymandering, what do you anticipate the impact of the governor's new kind of moderate PAC having?
So I think the thing about, just to back up, Laura Kelly appeared on our podcast on Monday of this week outlining her middle-of-the-road PAC. She's putting it together to support what she sees as moderate or middle-of-the-road candidates from both parties, something that created some grousing from Democrats online about that. I think what the governor is looking at specifically is her last 2 years in office, because this was a very difficult session, this most recent one, 2023. It was down to a wire. A lot of the overrides, because this is the important thing to understand. Republicans have a veto-proof majority, but the veto-proof majority is really, you know, it's right on a knife's edge. And so if 2 or 3 people change their mind, it's no longer veto-proof, right? And so many of the overrides of Kelly's vetoes this year were by, you know, just 1 vote. So I think she and the political folks around her are looking at this and saying, you know, gosh, if we can get 2, 3, 4 votes different in the House of Representatives, be those Democrats, be those Republicans, you know, and a lot of people say, oh, you know, there's no trusting the Republicans, there's no way Republicans will ever vote for anything good. There are 2 Republicans in the House of Representatives, Mark Schreiber and is it David Younger? What was that? Something younger. It's from Ulysses. They actually voted with Democrats in upholding vetoes on almost all of the legislation that people paid attention to. And so while there are people that really want to go out after Marvin Robinson, who's the Kansas City, Kansas Republican, who, not Republican, he was a Democrat, that's the point. He was a Democrat and then voted with the Republicans on everything. If people want to attack him, which, you know, they might, you know, they might be justified in doing or not, they should also realize that there were at least these couple of Republicans who really stood up over and over and over again, and they're going to be targeted. Like, they're going to be targeted by their leadership and their party. So I think Laura Kelly feels if she can find a couple of Republicans or like that, or get a couple of Democrats to take over seats where there might be less appealing Republicans to her, that's going to be worth it. I think the real challenge is, I don't know that she has her time horizon set much further than the end of her term in 2024. I think there is a larger issue at play in terms of, you know, more Democrats, more moderate Republicans, all of that. I think there's some real interest in the world of PACs and money in Topeka in trying to get more legislators like that elected, and all I can say is stay tuned. You'll be seeing more about that soon.
So really what she's trying to do is push back, it's a belated pushback to the Brownback era where he went after moderate Republicans in the Senate, and that's continued into the House. So the cadre of moderate Republicans that was there a decade ago has been eviscerated. And there's a lot of money went into this process from the Kansas Chamber and Americans for Prosperity. So they just poured money into legislative races, House races. And so right now you have 2/3 majorities. The Senate one is by pure numbers broader than in the House. And so the real quest is to flip some votes in the House so she can get away, she can block veto overrides that way. You know, the Senate will do whatever they're going to do, but the real battle will be in the House next fall. And we'll see what the Democrats and the Mod-Rs can do.
I consider public schools core to our democracy. And I've been surprised with some leadership in the State House with open hostility to public schools and teachers. What do you perceive as a threat, or what is the political strategy there?
Well, I'll just say a couple quick things and hand it off, because there's a lot of things you can say about it. I think there's political people that think all teachers are just walking lockstep and are all liberals. And I volunteered for 20 years in Lawrence Public Schools, and that's just absolutely not true. There's hardcore conservatives and liberals and a bunch of people in the middle that don't read the newspaper and are apolitical. And so, but there's a belief that they're all liberals. They're all big union people, and they're ready to march in the street. And I think there's the animus to that, the NEA, but there's also a push to try to support private education, Catholic schools, and try to funnel voucher money into private schools. And that is just going to come out of the pockets of the public schools themselves. And, you know, it's a real jihad against K-12 public education. And to me, it's a huge mystery as to why anybody would do that, but it's a real phenomenon and it's growing.
And It's exactly what Tim was saying here. I do think the end goal is to like destabilize trust in public schools and trust in public school teachers. Like, I hate using the term culture war so much because I use it a lot, but it's true. The rhetoric we're seeing now, anti-DEI, the woke agenda, indoctrination of teachers, that's all like a concerted effort to, again, destabilize trust and really push the school voucher program. This year, I think, was one of the closest times we've come to passing the school voucher bill. And one of the most recent forms of that would have allotted, I think, $5,000 and, like, again, unsupervised money to any private school, unregulated, unaccredited. So, yeah, we're seeing, again, this push towards school vouchers and then private education. And will that be good for Kansas public education? Yeah, I heard that. As someone in the audience said, hell no.
Rachel, you wrote about a public forum where the chairwoman of the House K-12 Budget Committee said that what we really need is more Jesus in schools because kids have a God-sized hole in their lives. I asked a Topeka representative who's a Democrat and actually runs a church in Topeka, and he said that's a pretty big hole. I think there's these two issues. One is the cultural issue. We wrote a church and state series about this, but also there's the money that's driving this. I think there's still a lot of resentment that the courts are requiring the legislature to fully fund public schools. You know, they got away with not doing it for, since 15 years. But this past school year is the first time that they finally reached the same level of funding they were at in 2006. You know, because they started cutting during the economic crisis in 2008 or leading up to that, and then the Brownback years, there was open hostility there. They tried block grants, all of that. And then when they passed the plan to fully fund, it was a 5-year ramp up. And so we're just now to where they're fully funded. And I think there's just still a lot of anger that the courts made them do this. And there are forces from people who represent really wealthy businesses that don't want to pay so much in taxes to support schools and individuals. And so that's really the drive here, I think, to attack the integrity of public schools so that you can justify pulling money away from them. And that's also why we're seeing this interest in redirecting funding toward private schools. They like to talk about this as a school choice bill, but we know that most of the counties in Kansas don't even have access to a private school. And when we looked at the fiscal note of this, it was going to cost about $150 million, and about $135 million was going to go to students who are already enrolled in a private school. So it's not about creating a choice for anybody, it's just about taking all the money back to the people who can afford to send their kids to private schools to begin with.
Yeah, so again, Sherman was talking about our State House series, which I'm sure everyone in here has read and really enjoyed and probably printed out and put on their fridge. But we've just been hearing, like, the God-sized tool, I think, is the most egregious one, right? But we've heard, like, a lot of different lawmakers, I'm sure, Tim, you've heard it too, say stuff like, oh, they're teaching kids, like, poop in litter boxes, which, again, is not true. That is not happening anywhere, let alone here in Kansas. So we're hearing more and more, like, outright hostility, I would say. I was talking to one Kansas Teacher of the Year. She was like she won a Milken Fellow Award, which is very high ranking, in the teacher circles. And she said she was, just really upset, almost in tears, driving back because she just was faced with such anger from lawmakers who were asking her, what is the solution? And she said, please listen to us. And then they basically said, no, we will not listen to you. Sorry.
So 2 real quick points, and then to Allison as well. We all have things to say. I think one thing that's really important when you look at the legislature too is that Cindy Holscher, who's a senator, Democratic senator, makes a big point of this, which is always asking how many members of the Kansas legislature actually have children in the Kansas public schools at any one time. I believe the number she had at one point was like maybe 4. And we're talking about 125 members of the House of Representatives, like 24 in the Senate. What was that? 40 in the Senate, sorry. I don't know how I came up with that. But the point is, that's not very many people with actual direct day-to-day knowledge right now about what's going on in public schools. Everybody else is literally hearing it from a friend, of a friend, or from Fox News or wherever. And they are exploiting the fact that, yes, a lot of parents were upset with how public schools were handled during the pandemic. But okay, folks didn't quite know what to do then. There were a lot of bad, it was making a choice from a menu of bad decisions. But folks who wanted to shut down public schools or weaken public education, just wedged their way in right then, and so it became, and you could see it happen. It was first critical race theory, and then it's all of the, this transgender panic. Now we're seeing it with diversity, equity and inclusion. Like they're just trying over and over again to say that something evil and nefarious is going into the public schools. And if you actually look at nationwide polls, the only people who think these things are true are people who don't have kids in public schools. When they actually survey parents who have kids in schools, they're like, oh, they're fine, we like them. The other issue is once you start down this path of the vouchers, and because this has happened in other states, other places like Florida, it permanently damages what goes on in the public education system. Because in Florida, for example, they do not have enough public schools for all of the students. If everybody in Florida decided to go back to public schools, because they're vouchers that allow them to go to private schools if they want, they don't have enough buildings. They don't have enough teachers. So essentially that's, I think that's the goal. But
so for perspective on the length of this public school funding issue in Kansas, when they started cutting, I was in elementary school in Shimishin, and then I covered the Gannon Supreme Court case as an adult. So it's, at this point, we've affected generations of public school kids in Kansas. And I think if you want to look to what happens when you stop valuing your public schools, look no further than Kansas City, Missouri, where, for years and years, the City Hall, which I covered, has offered tax incentives to developers that take money out of the public schools. There have been, there's a significant charter school presence in Kansas City, and there's been the same effort to redirect funding into vouchers, and Kansas City Public Schools is just now accredited for the first time in a number of years. And so it's been, as somebody who, all of my friends' parents located in the Shimishin School District went in the 90s just to put their kids in these phenomenal public schools, to see that reversal where the legislature is not putting all of its effort into public education is just it's so wild and out of touch with what I think a lot of people, especially in the Kansas City area, moved to Kansas for.
Hi, it's a totally different topic, but from the referendum last summer, the second amendment proposal was on the sheriffs, and that passed. And I may be reading the wrong papers, but I just haven't heard much about the impact of that or what you think is coming because of that amendment.
So the issue there was on the ballot was the removal of a sheriff, restricting that. And it was all about the Johnson County Sheriff, and the Johnson County government was trying to get rid of their sheriff, who's a little bit bizarre. He's a conspiracy theorist and, election fraud and all this stuff, and thinks he's the most powerful person in Johnson County government. And he's butting heads up against the administrators of the county as well. So it's really a piece of legislation to solidify his hold on his position as sheriff. And it became a statewide law. I think every time you pass a law like that by singular anecdote, you end up with unintended consequences that are damaging way down the road in in much greater ways. So that really had something to do with one county, and it really wasn't an issue anywhere else, but they put it into the Constitution just to protect that guy. So, and I think that left him in there, and the only way to get rid of him is to vote him out.
Yeah, that amendment was sold as the idea that every sheriff should be an elected position rather than an appointed one. But buried in that amendment was the real issue, which is how you investigate a sheriff for wrongdoing, and basically makes it very difficult to do that, to really launch an investigation. The Attorney General alone is now responsible for keeping track of all 105 county sheriffs, and probably doesn't have really an interest in doing it.
Yeah, and so that's the other issue. Attorney Generals run on their big loyalty and their big bear hugs with local law enforcement. And so do you think for a second that Chris Kobach, Derek Schmidt, whoever it is going to intentionally alienate one of the sheriff bros out there and run him out of office for malfeasance? The answer is no, because why would you undercut your future political capacity to win votes and endorsements? So it's kind of a weird situation, you know. Sheriffs, I think, probably have a bit too much power.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for what you're doing when you report and we get that information, and thank you for being here. And I know you've been across the state at different town halls, because I know my friend Chris is following you around. And I know there's probably a different flavor of questions and what you get from that, and I hope to see a follow-up of all of your town halls and report out what you hear from across Kansas, because you know we hear about the powerful Johnson County and that one amendment thing, but I know there might be some things that we do have in common all across the state, and hopefully we get to hear a follow-up. Thank you.
So I'll just say something about that was brought up repeatedly at the Salina forum, very much like this one. It's about the same number of people. They were incredibly frustrated that they can't get the youth vote out, and that they want more Democrats to vote, but they're frustrated that the Republican mods always expect the Democrats to support the Republican mods as candidates, when the Democrats would just as soon elect Democrats, right? So there was kind of a frustration about getting Democrats elected across the state, because they're really compacted into urban areas. And the idea of, they were just tantalized by the fact that a lot of youth poured in to the August election last year on abortion rights. And they just want those people to return to the polls all the time. And I think the liberals or the Democrats or the moderates would have a much better chance winning elections if they had those strong of youthful votes with them. So that was just one of the things that was discussed out there.
I will note that I've been to a number of these as well. Almost everyone brings up education. Strong public education, across the board is very important. I do think what's interesting is as you get, further out west, there's definitely a lot more of what happened to the Republican Party from people who still think of themselves as being members of the Republican Party. And just not really identifying. I mean, sometimes these are people who used to be leaders in the Republican Party in the legislature who show up and are just, and ask us, what happened? So.
We've been to Council Grove, North Newton, Hutchison, Valley Falls, Salina. I forget where all, I think maybe a couple of others. We'll be in Emporia in a couple of weeks, and trying to finalize details for one in Great Bend next month. One of the things that stands out to me when we go around the state and we get to hear from you is that, as Clay said, there's a lot of interest in education. There may be different flavors from one town to the next, but kind of overwhelmingly people are interested in things that are impacting their daily lives, and they want to know about education. Why can't we have Medicaid expansion again? And maybe there's interest in medical marijuana, and when are we going to protect the water, and all of these issues. But there's a question earlier about the legislature being out of step. nobody anywhere stood up and said, I think the most important thing in my life right now is that we make sure to pull down all the athletes' pants so that we know who's on which team. Those sort of things. You just wonder why they're so out of step. I don't know what the answer is, but what we hear from these town halls is very different from what we hear during the legislative session.
Hi. So I must have been in a void because I didn't know anything was going on in Marion, and I live 45 minutes from there. But I contacted the chair of the Democratic Party, who's a good friend, and said, what the heck went on in Mount Marion yesterday? And so just as a little add-on, and I hope you all follow up on this, apparently there was a Jake LaTurner, and then they called the police, and okay, I missed that. So anyway, she confirmed it, and apparently they're having all kinds of meetings and about it. And then the other one, a comment that she had made, Kansas has 105 counties and 9 of them had an increase in population. 9. And the majority of that 9 are way east.
Yeah. I do think that Jake LaTurner is just sort of like a bystander in this drama in Marion County. He showed up to a routine meet and greet with the public, had no idea that the person who owned the building there was going to throw the media out. And so everything kind of came in dominoes after that. I don't think Jake LaTurner had anything to do with the raid or any of that.
So I would just note that in terms of the population, I think this is something that a lot of people do not understand about Kansas. They just look at the big rectangle and they're like, oh, it's Kansas, it's a big rectangle. But the fact is, I was in Alabama visiting my husband's family, and at some point his mother was talking to him and saying, well, we have counties in Alabama where there's not very many people. And it's like, it means that there's maybe, 20 per square mile or something. And Max is like, you have no idea. Because you have this idea that there's like rural counties, and there are rural counties in Alabama, but there's a step below rural counties, which is it's the frontier counties. And that's where you have 2 or 3 people per square mile. And it is sometimes difficult to wrap your head around when you look at that huge western expanse of the state, how few people are there in some cases, and also how I think sometimes as Kansans, that makes us really discount what the state is. Because if you think about what the average Kansan is these days, just purely by numbers, it's probably someone living in that northeast corridor, that I-70 corridor from Manhattan, up through KCK or, the burbs around that. And that's a very different vibe. It's a very different population.
The population issue is interesting when you have elections, because Laura Kelly focused on 10 counties and wanted to do as best as she could, win some of those, be very close, but then another 95 of them, she just didn't want to get her ass kicked super hard. So don't lose 1 to 13, lose 1 to 7. And then she was barely, she beat Chris Kobach doing this, and she beat a more formidable opponent, Derek Schmidt, doing this as well. I'd have to say that the Schmidt race was a little bizarre because Dennis Pyle, the insurgent independent, swiped some votes from Derek Schmidt. And there's a lot of super conservative Republicans who didn't think that Derek Schmidt was pure enough Republican. And so they must have stayed home. And so it's a little bit bizarre, and so she had some benefit from that. But the calculus of focusing on 10 counties is one of the things Democrats do.
I have a question. I first want to thank you all too for what you do. First thing I do in the morning when I get up is register to and let's me know what's
Probably
going.
get a coffee first.
No. Actually, sometimes I need alcohol afterwards. You said you went to Hutchinson, and I'm active with the LGBTQ community here. I'm part of Key Flag, and I have a child who's LGBTQ, and I have to say that separation of church and state was really kind of a gut punch to me, because it's what I saw in the State House when I went there for all the terrible legislation this year. And I want to know if you went after, if there were people who felt bad about what was said and what was going on.
Are you talking about when?
Well, what they,
So
they
Republicans saying disparaging
they want the people just to go away. They were saying they were despicable
right.
and all of that. And so I'm just wondering.
Are you talking about the conservative enclave in Kansas?
Right. Did you go to Hutchinson after that? Did you hear from people and say this? We don't believe what these people believe.
So we went to Hutchinson in March, and if we back up a little to last summer, some of you may recall that there's a group of Republicans who meet in Reno County every month, and somebody who attended those meetings had leaked audio to me because their guest speakers were people who were officials with the effort to pass the constitutional amendment. And during this meeting with 2 state senators talking about this and these organizers for the movement, they all acknowledged, yes, of course we're going to completely ban abortion without exception, and we have the legislation already written. So I was able to write that story. So when we come back in March to do this town hall, Clay and I were there, and we were meeting with a group of supporters for dinner before, and somebody said, you know, they make this announcement now at the start of the meetings that you're not allowed to record, and it's illegal then if you do. And I said, that's not true. You can record anything. It's a one-party consent state. They can record whatever they want and send it to me. And they said, oh, that's very interesting. So by the time we got home that night, I had an email that said, hey, here's a recording of the last meeting. You won't believe what these people just said. That was in mid-March, late March, somewhere in March. You know, we had to get through the end of the legislative session, and then there's a 2 or 3 week break in April. And I kind of knew in March, like, this would be more important than just doing a one-off story that said some people said some silly things here. We got to the end of the session, and then Rachel and I spent a lot of time in April and then into May trying to pull this series together so that we could say, it's not just that some crazy people in Hutchinson have some bad ideas. This is actually the common theme in all of the legislation that we're seeing this year, motivated by really fringe conservative religious beliefs. They want to make Kansas a conservative sanctuary and run everybody else out. And you know, it's kind of shocking that what should be an extreme fringe set of beliefs is actually the predominant view in the legislature. So that's what this series was about. I will say after that came out, of course, all the people that we were quoting just doubled down on it. First they tried to claim that we had misquoted them, but of course we had the audio, so we published that and said, Clay did a column kind of going point by point, yeah, here's the actual words in your mouth as you're saying them. So
they were sarcastic. They were sarcastic.
Yeah, then they said, well, we didn't mean it when we said that. Then, Senator Mark Stephan, who's the Republican from Hutchinson, said, well, what we really need is just a conservative Kansas Reflector. And we said, well, that sounds great. More reporters is great, just as long as you adhere to the same standards we do, write whatever you want. Of course, that's the hang-up. They don't really want what they want is a biased news outlet. And so I don't know if they are actually going to come up with something like that or not, but I think people of Hutchinson and everywhere across the state, even in places where there might be a 2-to-1 vote in favor of Republicans, conservatives, it's important to remember that 2-to-1 is not 3-to-0. Like, there are these people in every corner of the state who have very different beliefs. Just like in Lawrence, there are people who have very conservative ideas, and I don't think we should discount anybody across the state. So we try to be respectful of that.
I just want to comment about the religious issue. So if you look over the last 20 years in the State House, the open, out loud expression of religious faith is much louder right now than it was 20 years ago. There used to be kind of a grudging acceptance of the separation of church and state. Now people will get up on the floor of the House and Senate or in committee and just recite scripture to explain why they're voting for something. So there's certainly people in the Capitol that want to create a theocracy type of government in Kansas, which I think was at the core of what Brownback aspired to do. He was not an effective chief executive of the state, and so that effort kind of floundered. But that's really a core idea of some people. Obviously the Constitution stands in their way, but in little ways they can nibble away at that that idea of a separation.
And then not to hammer home this point too much, I'll be quick about this one, but Mark Steffen also, in another part, I'm not sure if anyone else read that story, but a couple of people from Loudlight, which is a youth advocacy group that brings people down to the Capitol, they brought some people into his office to ask him a couple of questions. And then one of them was a Muslim woman. She said, how do you plan to represent some of your non-religious, or people that are not your same faith, that are in your group that you represent? And he said, I can convert you. And then they sent us that audio and we published the story, and then he said they're lying, and then we published his audio saying him, and then he said it was God's test to him. Sherman actually wrote the follow-up. I forget his exact words, but was it something along the lines of,
God was just giving him this challenge.
Yes, God was giving him a challenge and he failed because he lied to us, I think. Something along that line. But he never said, no, I do not want to convert them.
So is there a question here? And Bob has a question back there. So you go ahead.
Okay. Just this week, I learned that there is a Kansas Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training called CPOST. And my question is, will you be writing an article on what CPOST does in regards to that any of us in this room can file a complaint about a law enforcement officer, and we can do it also anonymously, because CPOST, the commission, believes that they're doing a really good job, and because they're listening to all of these complaints and investigating them, but we don't think enough people know that you can file this complaint online to address these issues on law enforcement. And we think the word needs to get out that this exists.
So, for us, one of the challenges with this is you can file the complaint, but I don't believe that complaint is an open record. I believe in the past they've only given us substantiated complaints. So they'll investigate, and if they decide an officer committed some sort of misconduct or violation, we would have access to that finding, perhaps. So, for instance, we'll say hypothetically, we could ask if the police chief in Marion has ever had any complaints against him that they've substantiated.
But my point is that I don't think people know that they can do it.
Yeah, I think perhaps we should do a better job of getting that message out, that there is CPOST does exist, and that it is the process that's supposed to work so that people can file complaints about law enforcement officers. I think it's also supposed to exist so that when an officer is applying for a job with an agency, they could look and see if he had complaints everywhere he'd been before. I think increasingly, though, what we see are law enforcement agencies who don't want the liability, and so they never look for those backgrounds.
Question in the back.
I don't know if you can see me, so I'm just going to stand. Hi, I'm Shanna. I've written a few opinion articles one for you, Clay, a few weeks ago. I represent the deaf, hard of hearing community of Kansas. I serve on the State Commission for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing, and I want to personally thank you for giving a voice to those of us with disabilities. And I also want to say, I've lived in Kansas for over 25 years. I come from Oklahoma and Texas, where it's quite a bit different there. And coming to Kansas, I thought, I had heard so much in the late 90s about what a progressive state this is with the government. Kathleen Silvas, she was our governor at that time. And I was just very energized and excited being a young person in my 20s, voting and feeling like I have a difference in my vote. I don't see that as much anymore, even with our governor, Laura Kelly, doing everything that she can, seeing supermajorities in the House and the Senate. And I also am the parent of 2 teenagers and 2 college-age students. So trying to get them involved in local government is really difficult because they see that supermajority there and feel like their vote is powerless. How can we energize our young people to get up and vote and change things in the state and make us more progressive again?
Well, first off, thank you.
please write for us more. The column's great. So, and I would actually say that to any of you, just in terms of commentary. You know, I can only write so many days a week, so it's really important to have voices, you know, from all over the community. I think what you're asking is kind of the biggest and most important question that faces a lot of people in Kansas politics today. And my goodness, if I had the answer, I would probably not be working at the Kansas Reflector right now. Someone would probably be paying me a heck of a lot of money as a political consultant. But I also know that it's really difficult to look at this, even when I'm doing opinion. You know, we in the journalistic world can only do so much. You know, we can tell you about things that are happening. I can tell you what I think. We can offer perspectives. But a lot of times, when it comes to like really acting, when it comes to turning out to vote, when it comes to actually the kind of organization or mobilization that we know makes fundamental change, like that's not something journalism has kind of ever been set up to do. Like we do the informing part, and then a lot of other people kind of take it from there. I don't know that journalists are necessarily the best organizers, because a lot of times we're kind of cranky and you know, looking for corruption and wanting to see what's going on. So I don't know that you want us to necessarily lead any of your movements. But I think it takes a lot of people doing a lot of different things.
I think the key is you, and parents have such a huge role in trying to convince their children that voting is important, however they want to vote. You know, vote right, vote left. But I think the parents have a guiding hand there, that you can teach them the value of that. And so I always view that as really important. I mean, you have a much better capacity to convince them to go vote on an issue than we would writing a news story. And their peers as well would have an influence.
Okay, Allison, we're going to pass this over, but we're going to make the, yeah, I know, resident young person, oh, finally, intern answer.
Well, I can just speak on what I've seen, and as the resident young person, what I've heard. But there is this disconnect, I think, of what young people see and hear and how much they actually understand. Getting into politics can be really scary. I know, because I started here trying to get involved with all of this and understand it all. So again, if I had the answers on how to bridge that gap, I wouldn't be having to think of an answer here. But there is this separation, I think, with just what they know and what they know that they can do and the change that they can make. And that is a conversation to have, and the best way to do that, I don't know, maybe Sherman can tell you more.
Before I pass it to our formerly resident young person, so, you know, I'm working on a story now about how we had a record number of youth turn out to vote last August and really make a big difference in a historical moment, and then they all stayed home in November. I think candidates have to do a better job of talking to young people and talking to them about issues that matter to them. The people at Tufts University, there's a whole school there that studies youth vote, although youth is 18 to 29, so I guess Allison would be included in the youth vote for a few more months. They've surveyed young voters about what matters to them, and I believe, if I can remember the top 5 things, it was inflation, it was, yeah, jobs, particularly pay for those jobs, abortion, climate change, and gun control.
If you think about the Kansas legislature, the people in power are counting on the youth to be apathetic. They want it, they expect it, they've made voting much harder in Kansas, and they're not through with that project.
I have 9 more months as a youth, first and foremost. Thank you, it feels good. So I
I think Sherman makes a really good point about actually speaking to the issues that matter to young people. When young people are voting directly on issues like abortion, they turn out in big numbers. And I think for the most part, candidates do not do a good job of speaking to the issues that matter to our generation. Are we the same generation? No. Are you Zoomers? You're a Zoomer. Are you a Zoomer, Rachel?
I'm telling you.
I am a decrepit millennial. So, but you know, issues that matter to my generation are the fact that our parents at our age could buy, you know, the price of a house was about the price of their the amount of their annual salary. The price of a house in my neck of the woods is about quadruple my annual salary. And, you know, issues like that, housing, abortion, I know a lot of folks my age are starting to have kids or starting to say, I don't know what the world is going to look like when my kids are adults. Do I want to have kids who live on an uninhabitable planet? And so I think, you know, a lot of young people are not hearing candidates talk about the issues that actually matter to us and that are going to be, you know, affecting us 20 years from now. They're still talking to our parents. And our grandparents. Yes, thank you.
Yes, I'm curious about the reach of the Reflector. How are you tracking your readership, and what's the trend been over your 3 years of existence?
Yeah, I'm excited that year over year, we've been able to grow our audience 20 to 50% every month from the previous year. And we continue to grow. I think these kind of town halls help us to get our message out. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think over the course of a year, we'll reach 1 million people in the state of Kansas through our website. We have thousands of people who get our newsletter every day. We also measure it in terms of the 20 to 30 newspapers across Kansas who are republishing our stories on a weekly basis, and other online outlets. So, you know, even if they get all the traffic and we don't, that's okay, because we just want people to see the stories, to have access to it. So I think that's a good way for us to measure success.
If I can follow up on that just briefly, I'm just hoping that you'll address something about since the traditional financial model of journalism has kind of dropped away, what you see as the future for the nonprofit model.
Well, I think nonprofits can be part of the answer. It's, reporting the news for a lot of organizations in Kansas is still a business, and I respect that you have a business to make money, and that's driving a lot of the realities of why we have fewer reporters around the state. I hope that nonprofits can help put people back into those newsrooms, just like we've done at the statewide level. I think if it's partnering with community foundations or grants of some kind, we need more reporters in small towns all across the state. We see in the State House what powerful people try to get away with when a lot of reporters are paying attention. Like, you imagine what they would do if nobody was watching, And so I think that's happening in these little towns and counties across the state.
So when we first started 3 years ago, there were some of the State House reporters that I had worked with for 15 years, side by side, in an office suite, and they did not like the idea that the Reflector was being created and dropping 3 news reporters into the Capitol and giving away the copy for free without ads, and that newspapers could republish that copy for free. Newspapers, radio, TV, whatever. And I kept telling them that no one's going to lose their job, that we're an ad too, and that's been proven to be the case. Those other entities are still around. We're just trying to add to the number of bodies chasing political stories around, and I hope that's really what we remain, is that we're an addition to rather than some sort of subtraction, because we can't deal with any more subtraction.
I have a question for Allison. I think you wrote an article about the proposed Evergy rate hikes. And in the article, I believe you quoted the KCC, Kansas Corporation Commission, as denying an energy efficient initiative in Kansas because it was going to be too expensive, and that right now Kansas ranks 49th out of 50 states in energy efficiency. And I'd just like you to comment about that, and like, why would the KCC be against a more energy efficient Kansas?
Sure. So yeah, Kansas is 49th out of the 50 states plus DC, so third from the bottom for energy efficiency. The KCC did not deny it. The commission hasn't made a decision on it yet, but the staff of the KCC felt that it was too expensive, because the way these energy efficiency programs work is that Evergy charges the whole of the rate-paying customer base to offer these programs where they can offer rebates on energy-efficient appliances, more better insulation, weatherization, and so the KCC felt like the program that Evergy was proposing was too generous to itself. Evergy had come up with this program in partnership with a couple environmental groups and with the Citizens Utility Ratepayer Board, which is a consumer advocacy group. So there was some pretty widespread agreement on this program, but the internal staff of the KCC felt like it was too expensive. And so there are two programs before the commission. One that was the original set of programs that Evergy and these groups proposed, and a slimmed down version. And so the KCC has yet to make a decision on that.
I just want to add a consumer point of view on Evergy. Watch them in the Capitol. They're a powerful influence in the State House. And in terms of the KCC, every time they want to scratch an itch, they get a 10% profit on it. It's a built-in profit that in the investor-owned utility. So I just think that's a problem between delivering the energy that we all expect. We want our lights to turn on and everything, and delivering that, and delivering energy in an efficient manner. And I don't think power companies make more money unless we just pay them to do efficiency. They don't make more money by selling less energy. So I think there's just kind of a general belief that energy efficiency programs should kind of be a second tier item. That's just my opinion.
I have two things. One is on the subject of energy. I just purchased an EV, and in Kansas, I got to pay a penalty. So it was more expensive for me to tag out and tax out on my car because I'm not using gas, and they're not getting the tax from the gas. So they actually charge you. If I was in California, I think I get about $7,500, and that's not the rebate, that's on California money. They pay people money to drive an EV. Interesting comparison. I'm surprised we're 49 and not 50.
Well, there's always Wyoming. So.
Yeah, okay, there you go. And then the second thing, just a plug for the Reflector, and that is, you didn't mention it, and you're probably like me, I don't do a really good job with fundraising, but it's incredibly easy to pay them for the work that they do. And so on their website, please go there and put in a monthly draw from your checking account. You won't even notice it, and it's the best money you spend.
I have a tip jar on my desk, but it's not working well because I work from home. So.
My understanding is that there's a mutual fund company that owns about 40% of Evergy. Am I correct?
I don't know the percentage, but generally speaking, yeah, places like BlackRock, Vanguard, etc. own pretty large shares of investor-owned utilities because they're a pretty sure bet. You know, they're not going to go out of business tomorrow, and they usually have a pretty slow but steady climb in terms of share price.
Hi, I have a 20-year-old daughter, and like a lot of that age group of kids, they don't do anything with emails, don't don't want to read them, don't want me to forward them to them. Is there any chance? What is she laughing because that's the way she is?
I'm 22.
Yeah, any other option to get to the youth, to get them out and get them interested in voting besides emails? And my second question is, the August abortion deal and then the lack of turnout in November about sent me through the roof. Do you have any idea if the national DNC paid attention to us for about 2 months or 3 months, and then when midterms happened, they went, oh, their usual selves, and we're going to get no attention from anybody other than Republicans?
So first of all, I'm going to answer the first question, which is that we are on TikTok. And now I should remember what our actual ad is on TikTok, but you can just search for it. Just search for Kansas Reflector on TikTok. You'll find it. Sam actually posted a couple of TikToks yesterday that have blown our follower count through the roof. We had 700 followers yesterday, and now have, I think, over 5,000. So no, I mean, and I think it's actually really important what you mentioned about email, because I think one of our core principles at the Reflector is we are going to try to meet you wherever we are, wherever you guys are. So we're on Instagram, we're on Threads now, on Twitter, on Facebook, and certainly if you want the longest version of the story, the one that's on our website or the one that our newsletter sends you to, I mean, that's most of the details. But if you're only on social media or if you're only on TikTok, we want to be able to give you the news that way too. It's all the same to us. We get paid either way. It doesn't depend on how much, exactly how many people visit each story on the website. That engagement, however we get it, is important.
The second part of your question was about reproductive rights and whether the DCCC paid any attention. I think they sure as hell did. And after that August vote, Sharice Davids talked about little else in her congressional race and prevailed and beat Amanda Atkins by a wider margin than she did the 2 years before. But I think these abortion rights votes in other states are occurring, and there's a political movement behind abortion rights to use that as a political tool in elections. And I think the litmus for that was in Kansas, which followed closely after the reversal of Roe v. Wade. So there was, which shocked the heck out of the Kansas politicians who threw that on the ballot. I mean, they had planned the timing, they wrote the amendment, they picked the primary, they controlled every element of that, even what it was called, and it turns out that they chose poorly.
We're going to put the intern on the hotspot again, but just to add on this really quickly, I mean, abortion is just such a huge issue, especially for young women of our generation, Like, coming from Louisiana, any one of my friends, I was talking to them about it, like, any one of my friends from home, they would have to drive up here, which is almost 20 hours, just to get, like, any access to reproductive care. So Louisiana, the closest place you can get an abortion is here in Kansas. So it's just like, and the importance of this issue cannot be understated, because it's not just a political tool, it's a day-to-day reality for everyone. But now to the more lighthearted part of this, what can they use besides the email to reach the youth?
Okay, so we've already plugged TikTok. TikTok is a great tool. It's important when talking about TikTok that this is like a legitimate thing that people in Gen Z and younger people use to get news. It's not just a dancing app for kids, right? Like, there's really good information on there. Try to take that seriously because it is a good tool. I think that also when talking to the youth, remember that even if just to begin with, they're reading a headline, they're reading a lead and not the entire story, if they like get used to that and get into news, that might help. And also just talking about these topics, people who aren't really familiar with politics and aren't really having that base knowledge that we have or we've been talking about, leading with like things and topics that they care about, abortion, those words that they can understand and really resonate with, something that's like really scary and you know that it affects them, but don't lead with the names that you recognize and they don't, or the really technical terminology that you recognize and they don't. Just be patient, learn with them. That's kind of my takeaways from listening. I've had friends in different states that I've talked to where they're crying about politics and abortion and things that they don't know if they can live in the state that they grew up in, and they don't know if they can continue just living their life, and that can be scary. And not to just keep on rambling, but mental health is a big topic, and even just how hard it is to continue focusing on these topics when just living day to day and waking up can be hard, especially with some of these things that affect you. So just be patient with people, learn with them, and if they are getting news from TikTok, let them and encourage it. So.
I've been really encouraged when I've talked to young 20-somethings and teenagers in Kansas, because I feel like this generation is far more civically engaged than any other, certainly far more engaged than I was at that age. You know, understanding what's going on in the world around them. I just think there's a divide there between knowing what's going on and wanting nothing to do with this dirty political system that they really detest. And I think trying to bridge that gap to get them involved in actually registering to vote and casting the vote, you know, that's one of the challenges. I don't think it was the DCCC that I would point to as having a failure last fall. It was, I didn't see hardly any legislative candidates talking about these issues. You know, 2/3 of Kansans or more support reproductive health rights, access to marijuana, Medicaid expansion, some sort of gun control, and these are all issues that make a real impact with kids as well. And nobody was talking about this, like they're afraid to make this their platform. And I don't understand why that was, but I think that's why they left a lot of votes on the table.
I have one more question and then just closing remarks.
Last question.
Tim, I think it was you who mentioned the very important fact that the growth that Kansas and Lawrence and Douglas County themselves are experiencing is much due to immigration. I mean, I often like to say that Lawrence is still in denial of its immigration growth, but I wonder to what extent the Kansas Reflector is considering better coverage of that population that is often bilingual, that there is a lot of misunderstanding, they're mixed status, some of them are coming of age voting, and you can guess which way they're going to vote. And but yet there's very little coverage. I don't know if you have bilingual reporters in your staff, or if you're thinking of a Spanish version of at least some section of newspaper at some point.
Well, thank you so much for that, and I think that is an outstanding, question and comment. So we have in the past, we've run a handful of op-eds that have had Spanish versions as well. I think, frankly, one of the challenges when you're doing this is, Kansas is such a large state, and when you start getting into some of the really interesting stories about immigrant communities, some of those things come, out of Dodge City, come out of Western Kansas, where it's, frankly, like just the mechanics of getting out there for some of that stuff is more difficult. However, I absolutely agree with you that it is a huge story, it is a huge ongoing story, and I think it's definitely something we could do a lot more with, both in news and commentary, especially. I've kind of done a series here and there where I go to various towns and stuff, and I've had some invitations to go out to Western Kansas, and that's largely a question of timing and scheduling and all of that, but I think there's a lot that we can do.
I think it's a great question, and Clay's right, but when we were starting this, one of the things we wanted to do is get out on the road, and we would use those road trips to interview people and write stories, but also mingle, and COVID shut us down for a couple of years. So we're way behind in that kind of outreach and getting out there and covering stories that we should be covering, Western Kansas and so forth. Go ahead.
But I'm sorry, this is not Western Kansas anymore. This is Douglas County. It's right here.
Okay.
No, and I think
closer to home.
Yeah. But I think it is
I think there's an onus on us to also just to make it very clear that these are stories that we want to tell and that we want to share. You know, I've seen it when I did there was a lot of coverage of these various anti-trans bills, and I wrote several pieces about it, and then we got a huge number of submissions from transgender people because they saw that, oh, you're writing about this. And so I think one of the tasks for the Reflector, and I think a great goal for us, is to engage more in these issues, both commentary and news, and then that hopefully also gets more, you know, a dialogue going with those communities as well, because that's absolutely vital, and it's a huge part of Kansas that, I mean, I don't know that many people are covering it well, or at all, at this point.
I was just going to say this is kind of at the top of my priority list, particularly if we could secure grant funding or community foundation support to establish a fellowship or some sort of position for somebody who was bilingual who could exclusively report on this topic. I think that would be a tremendous service for the state. So I guess in closing, thank you again for being here. I know sometimes, especially in the throes of the legislative session, things get really hostile. Lawmakers really don't like what we're doing. We hear a lot of negative feedback from them, and it is a great morale boost for my staff. I have the greatest staff I could hope for, to hear directly from people who do appreciate the work that we're doing and these kind of engagements like this. So it means a lot to us. Somebody mentioned earlier, if you go to our website, kansasreflector.com, we do have a donate button at the top. It's a tax-deductible donation as a nonprofit, and we appreciate any support that we get. So thank you so much.
Let's give them a hand. All right, so we've heard about big money behind the scenes. We can also have people power, many people donating small amounts. Let's keep a free independent press employed and working for us. Go out there and support them. And I invite you to come back to the next Women for Kansas meeting, September 23rd, where we're going to learn more about elder care. Thank you all for coming.